Hello everybody, it's Alex. Welcome to Papertrail. My guest today is Neil Williamson. He's a short story writer and novelist. His first novel, The Moon King, came out in 2014, and he's got a new collection out this month called Secret Language that I recommend you check out. Neil picked some interesting books, one of which in particular I really liked, and it was great to hear his thoughts on all three of them, why he thinks they're important, how they've influenced him, and just his thoughts on genre writing as a whole, actually. It was really interesting. Hopefully you'll enjoy listening to our discussion as much as I enjoyed having it. That's enough from me. Here I am speaking with Neil Williamson. Neil, welcome to Papertrail.
Thanks very much, Alex.
Pleasure to have you on. I'd like to just drop straight into this and start talking about your three books, and I think we'll go through them chronologically. That means we're going to start with The Wooden Sea by Jonathan Carroll, which I had never heard of and I loved. I really enjoyed this book, actually. So I'm curious, why is this book important to you?
It's an interesting one because Jonathan Carroll is an important writer to me. Jonathan Carroll is the writer I discovered in a small second-hand bookshop in Feltham in Middlesex when I lived in Middlesex in the early 90s, and I worked in a former munitions factory designing weapons that were being used in the Gulf War. So it was a bit of a grey time, and the only place that I could go to get some light in my life was a little plaza in Feltham, little square, and one of the shops there was a little second-hand bookstore. And I discovered two of Jonathan Carroll's books, Sleeping in Flame and A Child Across the Sky, and they absolutely blew me away with their weirdness and their the light that he brings to the imaginative aspects of his work. Carroll's a really adept master at putting little spots of the fantastic into the domestic, and that's what I really discovered from that. So actually, I could have picked almost any of Jonathan Carroll's books, to be perfectly honest. So the question is, why did I choose that one in particular? And the answer to that question is, I chose that in particular for the sake of one scene.
Which one?
It's the scene. So just to set the scene for the listeners, it's in some ways it's a story of a man coming to terms with the different stages in his life. And there's a scene where he's hanging out with his teenage self, who in a diner.
Yes.
And they're talking about his dad, and his teenage self was a bit of a tearaway. And this the character in the now time is a policeman, and he's a bit of a tearaway, and they're having this conversation, and he's kind of getting to know himself again, sort of thing. And after they leave the diner, they walk through the town, and the town around them changes from the 50s to the present day in really subtle, skillful, almost subliminal ways. It's just changing as they walk through the town, and it's such a skillful piece of prose and such a difficult effect to pull off that I think he absolutely nails it as an effect.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think having read it, it's very sort of delicately done, the way he handles everything. But I think a word you used earlier to describe it is there's a delight in the way he does it. I think it's very accessible as well, and that makes it almost easier to accept the strange things that are happening as you move through the book.
Yeah, I think that's it exactly. It's there's a kind of oddness to Carroll's his normality, the way he paints normality. There's a kind of archness to it. A lot of his characters, not so much in the Crane's View books, this is the third one of, but in some of his earlier books, a lot of the characters are middle class, upper middle class kind of professions like architects and things like that, and and designers and writers, and there's a kind of not. It's not quite the world. Certainly not quite the world I live in necessarily. A lot of his characters, certainly at the early part of his career, tended to be relatively well off, and doing relatively well for themselves. But still, there's an oddness in their lives.
Mm.
So I think what I'm trying to paint here really is in his normal domestic, the way he paints a normal domestic. It doesn't sit the way ours does. For instance, his thing with dogs. There's always the dogs in Carroll's books.
Oh, really?
I think the Wooden Sea. I think that's the one that starts with the dog that dies, and he puts it in the trunk of his car and has to go and bury it. There is always something like that in Carroll's books. There's always a dog. Sometimes it's a talking dog. Sometimes it's it's something else. But there's little elements. I guess he's actually one of America's natural magic realists. That's really what Carroll actually is. And for years, I think he still does. For years he lived in Vienna, and maybe being an American resident in Europe has had an effect on him as well. I'm not sure, but there's something just slightly askew, I think is what I'm saying, delightfully slightly askew about the way he describes the world, that I really like. And when it brings the deeper aspects of fantasy, like the things that are in this book that are behind the world, there's a kind of alien presence, and there's a kind of cosmic conundrum going on, and all sorts of nonsense like that you suddenly, because the quotidian level of reality has been slightly askew, you're perfectly, as you say, he makes it really accessible for you to go, oh, that wouldn't, you don't go, oh, that wouldn't happen. You just go, well, okay, of course it would happen. It was in there all the time. It's always, all this stuff is all behind the scenes, and he's just drawing the curtain back aside a little bit and allowing us to see the nonsense that goes behind our reality.
Yeah. It's I think as well, we sort of talked about the sort of ease that he was handling that transition in the scene where they're walking down the street. I think this book really transitions, I feel, between genres as well at times. Like it starts, it's quite realist, and then it gets quite fantastical, and then it goes sort of sci-fi, and then it comes back to realism again. Like it's really effortless the way that he sort of did move through everything. I really enjoyed that.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I'm glad it wasn't a chore for you, because it's an interesting.
No, it was great fun. I really enjoyed that you sort of mentioned that he's having a dialogue with his older self, and that sort of the way it's exploring, how you feel about yourself and how you behaved in your childhood, I think is really interesting.
Yeah. And
looking at those periods of life and those changing points of your life, which certainly towards the very end of the book as well, become very, very important.
Yeah, exactly.
I was quite interested. I don't want to move on to it yet, but I was quite interested to sort of see this. And I think I see that in another one of the books that we'll talk about later, The Limits of Enchantment. I think there's sort of some parallels there between the two books.
I think so. These are definitely the kinds of books that I like best. So yeah, we will go on to talk about that Limits of Enchantment as well. But yeah, there's parallels there, and there's parallels in the when you deliver small amounts of the fantastical, it can have more of into the mundane. It can have more of an impact than a full Technicolor, Lord of the Rings type thing. So
yeah, you don't need the spaceships overhead.
You do not. What I think is interesting about Carroll, though, and I've recommended him to people for years and years and years. So it was like 1990 when I lived in London. So we're talking 25, 26 years now. And some people read them and go, I totally get why you like that. And some people read them and go, but I don't get it. And as you say, he jumps. It's partly because he jumps genre. People who like realist books don't like the fantastical stuff. People who like sci-fi don't like the fantastical stuff and the realist stuff. And people who like fantasy don't like the sci-fi stuff and the realist stuff. But for me, that's what we should be aiming for. What we should be aiming for is stuff that you don't get anywhere else. It's not in a box. It's stuff that's going to surprise you. And that's what I love most about good writing, is when it surprises you.
Yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, I think I was definitely surprised by this when I was reading it. I'm curious. I didn't realize when I was reading it, when I get the recommendations through from my guests, I try not to read about the books until I've read the books. I didn't know it was a part of a trilogy. How separate are the three? Like, I read that third one with no real need to read any of the others. But do you think that adds something? Do you think you should start with the first one and go through, or?
I'll be honest, Alex, I can't remember. I can't remember what order the other two come in. Which would lead me to believe that no, you don't have to read the other two necessarily. It's been several years since I read all three of these, so I wouldn't be able to say. It's a good question, but I'm not sure I can give you a sensible answer for that.
No, that's fine. I mean, I felt it stood alone, but I'm always curious. Like there are little mentions that I'd noticed after doing the reading where they're sort of like, this is happening elsewhere. I was like, oh, I wonder if there's a grander scheme here that I can pick up on. So I think I will go back. I'll read the whole trilogy. I think I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. Good to know.
So from a book that I really, really enjoyed, jumping across to Zombie by Joyce Carroll Oates. I didn't hate this book, but this is an uncomfortable read.
That's why I picked it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was. I didn't. Again, not doing research, I didn't realize sort of the links to Jeffrey Dahmer until after I'd read it. But wow. Like it was very much a read a chapter, put it down, take a breath,
Yeah.
and then come back to it.
It takes a long for such a short book. It takes a long time to get through it, and steel yourself for it. Okay, so I picked this book because I used to read horror. I used to read a lot of horror when I was a teenager, and there was a point. I'm not sure what the point was, when suddenly, horror. I talked a minute ago about. I like books that surprise me, and there's nothing that was happening in horror that was able to surprise me, or even affect me. I think you read enough of it, it's got a relatively limited, I don't want to say a limited palette of ways of doing what horror does, and there are still people writing it well. I can read supernatural horror now and enjoy that, or supernatural stories. I don't think they're particularly horrific necessarily, but I can enjoy a good ghost story. But actual horror, it really has to be really, really good to get me. And I keep going back to it and looking at it and going, no, it's still not doing it for me. But when I read this one, it absolutely scared me. I'll tell you why it scared me. It utterly scared me, and it scared me because Joyce Carroll Oates, it's so successful at placing you in Quentin's head, and Quentin's an abuser and a killer. Inside his thoughts, that you find yourself beginning to empathise with him. And that's what's uncomfortable. It's how close am I? How close are my thoughts to someone who does these abhorrent things? How close are your thoughts to someone who does these absolutely repellent things? And to me, Zombie is still the most freak me out horror book I've ever read.
No, definitely, it's the most uncomfortable I've felt reading a book that I can recall, at least. It's very unnerving, and it's quite a divisive book, actually. Sort of reading up on people's thoughts afterwards, there are some people who are like, this is terrifying. It's a terrifying insight into a psychopath and into a killer, and there are some people who are like, this goes way too far. There's no reason to empathize. I'm curious to sort of so obviously you come down on the side of it's a terrifying betrayal. Do you think there's a reason that it's so successful in that sense?
I think she's just one of those writers who's got the skills and maybe the insight. Maybe that's what it is. I think she's a writer with an awful lot of insight. And sometimes when you use your insight and turn it onto the less appealing aspects of life and the human psyche, if you're going to do it well, if you're going to do it at all, you should do it well. You should commit to it. And I think she really did in that book. It's like, if I'm going to do this at all, I've got to get right in there. And I've got this thing I've been saying. I'm a member of a writers group in Glasgow, and one of the things that I think is really important in writing fiction is committing to your story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're going to do it, don't be half-hearted about it.
No, yeah.
Get in there and do it properly. You know, and that may mean asking yourself uncomfortable questions as a writer and as a person. But if that's the kind of story you're going to tell, then go and tell that story. You know.
Yeah, I don't think you can accuse her of not committing to the role in this book.
No, she didn't pull any punches. I think it's a terrifically well written book. It's just so effective that it's never left me. It's absolutely indelible. The effect it's had on me, and made me realise that I don't really ever want to have to write that kind of horror. So.
No, yeah. I think it's I think one of the things that makes it scary is it does feel thought out. There's a real scary logic to the sort of way he behaves and the way he gets away with everything as well.
Yeah, and it's a lot of it's little lies and little deceits and things that they're the kind of, he employs the same tactics that most people employ in their daily lives, to get out of having to go to the pub with your mates or whatever. It's the same techniques that we use, the same processes in thought, except he's just going and using them for much, much darker ends.
Yeah, it's I thought again, so it was quite interesting coming across the people who are pro and the people who are against it. There are a lot of people who said it was the way it's one of the funniest criticisms for me. Like, I can't sympathise with this serial killer enough. I was always like, well, I don't like. Why are you looking for these serial killers? I didn't like this at all. Yeah. I didn't understand him. I couldn't put myself in his position. Good, Yeah.
That's the goal, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
You should come out of this book going, thank God I'm not that guy.
Yeah, it's a hard one, because I would say that I enjoyed reading it, but I also really didn't enjoy reading it. It was a very hard one when I was in a pub talking about it with my friends. It was a very hard one to sell them on. I was like, it's really painful. It's really unpleasant to read, actually, but it's probably worth your time. Oh.
Yeah. You're making me feel guilty now.
No, that's part. One of the reasons I do this is expand my reading. It's and expand my experience of reading, and so it definitely did that, and I would recommend it to others. Is it? Would you say it's your favourite Joyce Carol Oates? Do you read a lot of Joyce Carol Oates?
I don't read a lot. I think I've read one other by her. So it's the shortest one of the two I've read. So it stands alone. I don't think it's something you can go. You can really compare it to the author's other work with a book that's like this. I think it just stands alone as a singularly unpleasant piece of writing, but singularly effective piece of writing. No,
very, very, very effective.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Do you feel when you're? I'd like to get to the third book in a moment, but I'm curious. When you're writing your work, do you feel like you're in dialogue with your own favorite pieces, or is it? Do you feel like you're responding, or do you feel it's more just they're there on the sort of on the boundaries of your own work?
Probably as close to the boundaries as possible. I've got I tend to have a really bad memory for the things that happen in books, which has made today a challenge. So I had to pick ones that really affected me. I remember bits and pieces that happen in books. When I'm reading books, I go, "Oh, I like the way they pulled that off," or that was quite an interesting thing, but I would have done it differently. But none of that is present in my thoughts when I'm writing something. It's not, I would have done it differently, therefore now I'm going to do it differently. It's limited, and I find myself looking for solutions to things when I'm trying them out on the page, and that's when these things tend to come out. And maybe later when I'm reading something back, I'll go, "Oh, that's actually quite a lot like," and I can see why I've done that. So it's not conscious.
No. I think that's probably for the best a lot of the time, isn't it? You don't want to be if you're if you're reading someone and then you write something and it comes out exactly like them, that's not it's not where you want it to go. As you say, you want to do something different every time. So it's probably good that it stays at the borders for you.
Yeah, I think so. I think it also would kind of interfere with your own voice a little bit. So or the voice that you want for the story. So I'm not a very methodical writer. I'm a very organic writer. So I come up with some sort of seed for a story or for a novel, and it just all kind of grows from there. So and everything that's in me sort of mulches into that. So I don't plan things out on a literal level.
No. Okay, well, so moving on from Zombie to The Limits of Enchantment by Graham Joyce. I said earlier that there are definite links here between, for me at least, with the Wooden Sea and Limits of Enchantment. I think in particular that sort of concern with childhood and the concerns and the fears that you feel when you're a child, and sort of accepting them and moving beyond them as well. I found that those links started to emerge for me as I was reading, sort of thinking back over Limits of Enchantment. So why is Limits of Enchantment an important book for you?
I think the answer to this one is similar to the answer I gave about the Wooden Sea, actually, because like Carroll, Joyce is a really important writer to me. He's another one of these writers who manages to do, it's the title of the book, to actually describe the way the fantastic can erupt out of the domestic, out of the mundane. And in several of his later books, Joyce was probing at this with more and more depth, and I could have chosen any one of several books to prove the same point, to be honest. One of his last books, his second and last book, is a book called Some Kind of Fairy Tale, which is a fantastic book about... I'm not answering the question. I'm going to answer the question in a minute. But Some Kind of Fairy Tale is a fantastic book about a family whose daughter vanished as a teenager, and their family home borders on a large bluebell wood, which over the years, because English mythology, English folklore has always been linked to stories of fairies and things like that. Anyway, she reappears 20 odd years later, looking exactly the same, and claims she's been taken away by the fairies. It's a lot more subtle than that. There's a lot more going on in it than that, and it's quite a short book. But his ability to juxtapose the things you would say to someone who reappears after some time away, against her stories of being taken away to this actual fairyland, and also give you hints that lead you to believe what she's saying could be true. And you realise the more you read that book, the more you want it to be true. There's so much skill involved in that I think it's a breathtaking book. But I chose Limits of Enchantment because it deals with something a little bit more head on, and something that I think it does really well is it Limits of Enchantment is set in Derbyshire or Nottinghamshire. I can't actually remember the location.
Leicestershire, I think.
Leicestershire, my mistake. Yes, right. And it's the point in English history where modernity finally overtook folklore. And there's the central character is a girl called Fern, who is the apprentice to essentially a herbalist midwife, to whom the people of the village have been going to, since the year dot, for the remedies and their help with pregnancies and all these sorts of things. But nowadays, modern technology is coming in, and there are hospitals and there are ultrasound machines, and attitudes are changing, and the attitude towards the old ways changes as the book progresses. And there's just the way he balances the reader's favour of both those things, I think is incredibly interesting, because neither one is painted as bad. It's not like technology is painted as the terrible destroyer of the old ways. It's modernity and technology are a thing, and there's nothing you can do about it. They're an unstoppable force, and the old ways are dying, and that's an unfortunate thing. And this young girl finds herself at the fulcrum of that moment in history, and it's a very, very skillful book.
Yeah, I think that agnostic tone sort of is so important to this book. Actually, the sort of it's very neutral in its description of like, this is what's happening, modernity is creeping in, but there are also these little suggestions of old folklore and these old things that are happening to people. And I think it's the fact that he's able to keep such a neutral tone of voice throughout the whole thing makes it all come alive a lot more than if he'd sort of been like, oh yes, everything's modern, but look, witchcraft.
Exactly.
Something
Well,
like that.
to his benefit, and this is one of the interesting things he does. There's hints that the old wise woman obviously has, because she's a herbalist, she knows all the plants, and she has folklorish ways about her. There's hints that you're going to want to believe that she has witchy powers of some description, but you don't see any evidence of them. There isn't any evidence of them. The only moment that could be described as being fantastical is the point where Fern essentially goes on a mushroom trip, attempting to perform a rite, I think, of some sort, which I can't remember the nature.
Speak with the moon.
Speak with the moon. That's the one. Yeah. And where the prose and the description up to that point has been so. I think the tone has been, as you say, agnostic up to that point. He just lets rip with the luminosity of the wonder of nature, and you have this glimpse into what it must have felt like to be working that close to nature, and believing that you were connected to nature in a mystical way. And all that sort of thing. It's just this wonderful little scene that pops out of the book, which again makes it like the wooden sea, because it's a key scene. It's a key scene where you see this eruption of fantasy.
And it's a key scene that you're building towards as well throughout the whole book. There's sort of these little allusions like, have you spoken to the moon yet? You should speak to the moon. Like, you're going to have to do it at some point. Like, I think that's where you get, with a lot of very successful weird fiction, I feel like there's always that, there's a slight mention of an odd thing, and you're like, what is it? And you're sort of, you're getting drawn deeper and deeper into these books, and sort of and then they'll give it to you, and because you've been waiting, it's so much stronger. But I think
exactly.
But the fact that I think that it returns sort of after that sort of that vision quest, or the hallucinations, that it returns again to normality again, like makes the memory so much stronger of that moment. Just in the same way that I imagine that memory will stay very strong for Fern, as she goes on for the rest of her life.
Exactly. Once she's left that part of her life behind and moved on with the modern world.
I think as well, the thing that makes it very strong for me is the way that the parallels are handled. Nearly every side of the coin is represented by the other side of that's a terrible way of saying it, but everything is paralleled wonderfully. Like right down to this whole idea of the moon is constantly referred to, and the moon is very important. But Fern is also very fascinated by the fact that there are now satellites in space, sort of rotating around the Earth. There are other things rotating around the Earth. And when she does go on her mushroom trip, there's a chase element to it. And then later on towards the end of the book, there's a chase which is again sort of, it's human again. It's but it's modern, and it's also acknowledging the old stuff. I just thought the whole way that everything was wonderfully tied together meant that the message wasn't maybe entirely it wasn't very subtle. You sort of like, okay, I see this, we're walking the line between sort of the old ways and the new ways here. But I think it made everything very powerful, and did make those sort of moments where fantasy sort of erupts a lot more powerful.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's a remarkable book. I really do.
It's also, I think, it's a very British piece of writing as well. I think it feels like very British fantasy. You know, it's very, it's very Midlands fantasy. You know, like it.
It's certainly very English fantasy. Yeah, but when I say English, I think you're right. Midlands is it's kind of heartland English mythology. The same kind of area that was formed the bulk of Robert Holstock's writing. If you know his work,
I don't know.
Mythical Wood and Levondis. There's a recommendation for you if you like mythical English explorations. Robert Holstock was the absolute master of that. He was a terrific writer. His first novel, Mythical Wood, was, absolutely key to British fantasy from the 80s onwards.
Yeah, I'll look him up because again, this was a book that I very much enjoyed and really, really good. It's always a pleasure. I've yet to come across a book that I've read where I'm like, oh, don't like this. I'm gonna have to talk about it. But I'm dreading the day when I have to have an argument on air with someone about this book's terrible. What are you talking about?
Yeah, well, I would look forward to it if I were you.
Yeah.
It's bound to happen at some point. It should make an interesting discussion because presumably someone's picked it because they've seen something in it that you don't.
Yes.
Or they panicked.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. There's always a chance they panic, but no, it's. Yeah. But yeah, no, it was great. I really enjoyed it. I think for me, all three of those are joined together by structure. That they're all the rules of the place, even in the Wooden Sea, where the rules are still very flexible. The rules are clearly stated in all three books. There's sort of the structures of the world, and I think as well. I remember when hearing you talk about your own novel, the idea of putting rules in place is very, very important for you. I seem to remember you saying.
I think that's fair. I think one of the interesting things about fantasy, as opposed to realist fiction. Realist fiction, everyone knows the rules, right? The rules are our experience of the world. It's the way the world works. There's the reason we read fantasy is for a different aspect, a different perspective on the way that people interact and the way that people do the reasons that people do the things they do, and but in order to allow that to happen, you have to put in place the rules so the reader understands why this world is different from the one we live in, as opposed, in what ways it's different, in what ways it's similar. In my novel, The Moon King, the main difference is the moon never sets. It's constantly in orbit round a city on an island. And because of that, it changes lots of things about what happens between people and what happens physically on the island. There's kind of all sorts of cycles linked into the lunar cycle. But it's a simple rule. So you give examples of because of the moon this, because of the moon this, but its effects filter out. And I think in all three of these books, we're looking at similar things. In Zombie, certainly, we're looking at the rules are you're now inside the mind of a psychopath. So the things you think of as good thoughts and bad thoughts don't necessarily apply.
Yeah, no. In Zombies, the rule not to get caught.
Yeah, and the other two are certainly it's like Limits of Enchantment. What the thing I like about it is and it's, again I'll repeat it, that it's very close in certain ways to some kind of fairy tale, is that this is the world you know, but there may also be a world you don't know. I'm not going to tell you if it's true or not. And the fact that you can keep you guessing and keep you wondering after the book's over is the real success of it, I think. Because what it makes you do is look at the world around you with a slightly different and less jaded and less cynical eye.
Yeah, it invites wonder. I think that's
right,
a way to think about it. I think that's always when I read a fantastical book, or any book with some fantastical elements. I think that's when I love it the most, is when you either look at the world that they're writing about, or you come away from the book and you look at your own world in a in a new way with wider eyes.
Yeah, that's why we do what we do. It's that's why I use fantasy in my stuff. It's like painting a picture of the world, but you get more colours in your paint box. So why not use them?
Yeah, that's a lovely way of putting it. Actually, no, I really like that. Finally, I'd like to. The Moon King is your first novel. You've got a new collection coming out, Secret Language, in June. Am I correct?
Yep.
And those, you are primarily a short story writer, or so far primarily a short story writer. But of the 3 books that we've got are all novels. Are there any sort of short stories in particular that jump out to you as well, or is there a reason that you've picked that sort of novels stand out for you as important texts?
No, not really. The reason I picked novels was because I would only have to concentrate on 3 things. If I could have picked short story collections. I do love short stories, so I didn't realize I could have actually picked individual short stories, which would have been much easier to do. But yeah, it's done now. Actually, on Jonathan Carroll, he has a number of short story collections, which actually are over as the years go by, increasingly big versions of the previous one. So every time one comes out, it's like the previous one with some more stories added to it. And his original collection was called The Panic Hand, and it has several stories in it that are still among my favourite short stories ever.
Brilliant.
Just in terms of the techniques they use and the effects he gets, the things he gets you to do as a reader at the end, it's really pretty neat. There's one which I would describe as my favourite, probably my favourite short story. It's called Learning to Leave, and it's about 2 friends, who are having a conversation. And so now I'm doubting my memory of it, because it might be in a relationship. It doesn't matter. 2 people who are close together having a conversation, and the one says to the other, "Tell me a story about your friend Honey." And Honey is a real character. So most of the story is a story of what happened when this person and Honey, her friend, went off to do something really ridiculous to get revenge on an old boyfriend, and how it turned a bit dark. But then the entire story, once that bit's over, the entire story just twists. There's something that happens at the end of the story which I won't give away, but there's a twist in it that you just look at the whole thing from the end, and it looks entirely different than it did while you were reading it. And you can read that story over and over again, and it still has the same effect. It's an excellent piece of writing.
Oh, I love stories like that. That's a Jonathan Carroll piece as
well.
Jonathan
Carroll as well, yeah.
Fantastic. No, I'll be seeking that out, I think.
Good.
Neil, I think that's the end of our time together. But thank you for coming on, and thank you for your recommendations. I really enjoyed reading all of them, and hopefully people out there listening are going to go out and check them out themselves. And I, for one, will definitely be seeking out more Jonathan Carroll and more Graham Joyce, and I'll probably read some more Joyce Carol Oates as well to see how I react to her other stuff as well.
Oh, thanks for having me, Alex. It's been a pleasure talking about this stuff, because the interesting thing about books is that, especially ones you read ages ago, is that you kind of forget the details until you start talking about them, and then it comes back to you. So I'm probably gonna have to go and dig them out and read them again.
Yeah, no, that's the best thing about talking about books, is you always, once you're done, you have to go back. You have to remember. You have to see what you missed, or see if you still love it quite as much as you did when you were talking about it in the pub.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Well, Neil, thanks again.
Pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Papertrail. Thanks again to Neil for coming on the show. I enjoyed that. That's the most prepared I've been for a podcast so far. Hopefully it showed. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do share it with your friends. I'm always looking for feedback and suggestions for authors or how I can improve. You can message me on Twitter at Papertrailpod, or leave a message on the website at www.papertrailpodcast.com. Thanks to Scott Grattan for the music. I'll be back next month with another interview. Until then, thanks for your time.